Kofi's hands trembled as he counted the coins for the third time. 12 bronze pieces. That was all he had left after paying Chief Okonkwo's land tax, and the next harvest was still 3 months away. He sat on the cracked wooden stool outside his mud brick house, watching his daughter Alma draw patterns in the red dust with a stick. She was 7 years old and hadn't complained once about being hungry, though he knew her stomach growled at night. "Papa, when will we eat the groundnut soup again?" Alma asked, looking up with eyes that held too much understanding for a child her age. Kofi's throat tightened. Groundnut soup had been her mother's specialty, the one meal that could make their small home feel like a palace. But Esi had died 2 years ago during the drought, and with her went the warmth that once filled their lives. Now, groundnut soup was a luxury they could barely afford. "Soon, my flower," Kofi lied, forcing a smile. "Very soon." The truth was far grimmer. His groundnut farm, once the pride of his family, had yielded almost nothing this season. The rains had come late, and by the time the crops matured, half of them had rotted in the field. What little he harvested had to be sold immediately to pay the relentless taxes that Chief Okonkwo demanded. The chief owned most of the land in their village of Adetala, and he showed no mercy to those who couldn't pay. Kofi stood and walked to the edge of a small compound, gazing at the vast estate that sat on the hill overlooking the village. Chief Okonkwo's mansion gleamed white in the afternoon sun, its tall walls adorned with intricate carvings and colorful paintings. Palm trees swayed in the breeze around a fountain that never ran dry, even during the worst droughts. The chief had 7 wives, countless servants, and storehouses filled with grain and yams that could feed the entire village for a year. Yet he always wanted more. Just last week, Kofi had watched as the chief's men took old Mama Abina's last goat because she was 2 days late with her payment. The woman had wept in the village square, begging for mercy, but the chief had simply laughed from his cushioned seat and told her that poverty was a choice. Kofi clenched his fists. He had worked this land since he was a boy, learned farming from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. 3 generations of honest labor, and what did he have to show for it? A hungry daughter, and a future that looked darker than the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Papa." Alma's excited voice broke through his thoughts. "Look, Brother Kwame is coming." Kofi turned to see his younger brother walking up the dusty path, a bundle wrapped in banana leaves tucked under his arm. Kwame was a trader who traveled between villages, buying and selling goods wherever he could find profit. Unlike Kofi, he had chosen a life on the road rather than being tied to the land. "My brother," Kwame called out, his face breaking into a wide grin. "I bring gifts from the eastern markets." They embraced, and Kofi felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Kwame was the only family he had left besides Alma, and his visits were always a bright spot in their difficult life. "You look thin," Kwame said, his smile fading as he studied Kofi's face. "Both of you. When did you last have a proper meal?" Kofi wanted to lie, to preserve his pride, but the concern in his brother's eyes made the words stick in his throat. "The harvest was poor this year. We manage." "Managing isn't living," Kwame said firmly. He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a small bag of groundnuts, fresh vegetables, palm oil, and even a piece of dried fish. "I bought these with you in mind. Tonight, we cook groundnut soup like Esi used to make. What do you say, little Alma? Will you help your uncle prepare a feast?" Alma's face lit up brighter than Kofi had seen in months. "Yes, Uncle Kwame. I remember how Mama used to make it." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the 3 of them worked together in the small kitchen area behind the house. Kwame showed Alma how to grind the groundnuts into a smooth paste while Kofi chopped the vegetables with practiced precision. The palm oil sizzled in the clay pot, and soon the rich, nutty aroma filled the air. For the first time in a long while, Kofi felt something close to happiness. He watched Alma laugh at Kwame's silly jokes, saw the way her eyes sparkled as she stirred the pot with a wooden spoon almost as tall as she was. This was what life should be, he thought. Simple moments of joy shared with the people you love. But Kofi didn't notice the figure watching from the shadows of the baobab tree at the edge of his compound. Didn't see the way Chief Okonkwo's senior servant, Taiwo, stood with his arms crossed, his nose lifted as he sniffed the evening air. The smell of groundnut soup, rich and savory, drifted on the wind all the way up to the chief's mansion on the hill. And in that mansion, Chief Okonkwo sat in his dining hall, surrounded by platters of food that he barely touched. His seventh wife had prepared him roasted goat, yam porridge, and fried plantains, but nothing satisfied him anymore. He was bored of luxury, tired of the same flavors day after day. Then Taiwo entered, bowing low. "Master, I bring news from the lower village." "Speak," Okonkwo said, not bothering to look up from the gold-rimmed cup of palm wine in his hand. "The farmer Kofi, the one who could barely pay his taxes, is cooking groundnut soup. The aroma is exceptional, master. I have never smelled anything quite like it." Okonkwo's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed. Groundnut soup? That poor wretch can't even feed his child properly, and now he cooks feasts. "It appears his brother, a traitor, brought him ingredients, master." A slow smile spread across Okonkwo's face, but there was no warmth in it. "Is that so? How generous. How very, very generous." He set down his cup and stood, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. "Prepare my walking stick, Taiwo. I think I shall take an evening stroll through the village. The air is pleasant tonight, don't you think?" Taiwo hesitated. He had served the chief for 15 years and knew that tone well. "Master, surely you don't mean to. Are you questioning me?" Okonkwo's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper.
"No, master."
"Of course not, master."
"Good."
"Because I suddenly have a taste for groundnut soup, and I always get what I want." As darkness fell over Adetala village, Kofi, Kwame, and Amma sat together around their small cooking fire. The pot of groundnut soup bubbled gently, almost ready to eat. They didn't know that their simple moment of happiness was about to be shattered. Didn't know that greed was walking down the hill toward them, wearing expensive robes and carrying a walking stick carved from ebony. The full moon began to rise, fat and orange on the horizon, as if the sky itself was watching to see what would happen next. The soup had reached perfection. Kofi lifted the wooden ladle and let a small stream of the thick, golden-brown liquid fall back into the pot. The groundnuts had melted into the palm oil, creating a rich base that coated the vegetables and fish in layers of flavor. Amma clapped her hands together, practically bouncing with excitement. "Can we eat now, Papa? Please." Kwame laughed and ruffled her hair. "Patience, little one. The best things in life are worth waiting for. Just a few more minutes to let the flavors marry together." Kofi was about to agree when he heard footsteps approaching. Heavy footsteps, accompanied by the rhythmic tap of a walking stick against hard earth. He turned toward the sound, and his blood ran cold. Chief Okonkwo emerged from the darkness, the moonlight glinting off the gold threads in his agbada. Behind him stood Taiwo and 2 other servants, their faces carefully blank. The chief's presence seemed to suck the joy out of the air like a sudden frost. "Good evening, Kofi," Okonkwo said, his voice smooth as honey, but with an edge sharp as a machete. "What a pleasant surprise to find you cooking." Kofi rose quickly, his heart hammering. "Chief Okonkwo, this is unexpected. How may I serve you?" The chief's eyes drifted to the pot of soup, and something predatory flickered across his face. "Is that groundnut soup I smell? It's been so long since I've had properly prepared groundnut soup. My wives, you see, they try, but they never quite capture that authentic village flavor." Kwame stepped forward, placing himself slightly between the chief and the cooking pot. "Chief, we were just about to have our evening meal. Surely you have plenty of—" "Plenty," Okonkwo interrupted, his voice hardening. "You presume to know what I have plenty of, traitor? I, who own half the land in this region. I, who could buy and sell you 100 times over." He paused, then his expression softened into something that might have been a smile on a more honest face. "But I am not an unreasonable man. I simply wish to taste the soup that smells so divine. Surely you wouldn't deny your chief a small courtesy." Kofi's mouth went dry. He looked at the pot, then at Alma's face, watching the hope drain from her eyes. This soup represented everything they had. The ingredients Kwame had brought were meant to last them several days, stretched carefully with grains and water. But how could he refuse the chief? Of course, chief, Kofi heard himself say. It would be an honor. Please allow me to serve you a bowl.
A bowl.
Okonkwo laughed, a booming sound that held no real mirth. My dear Kofi, you misunderstand. When I taste something, I taste it properly. I'll take the entire pot. Taiwo, fetch it. The entire pot? Kwame's voice rose in disbelief. Chief, with respect, this is all they have. This child hasn't had a decent meal in weeks. Surely you cannot. Cannot. Okonkwo's eyes flashed dangerously. You dare tell me what I cannot do? Perhaps you forget who holds the deed to this land. Perhaps you forget that I can have Kofi and his brat thrown out by morning if I choose. Alma made a small sound, like a wounded animal, and pressed herself against her father's leg. Kofi felt rage building in his chest, hot and terrible, but beneath it was fear. Fear for his daughter, for their home, for the fragile life they had managed to build. Please, Chief, Kofi said, his voice barely above a whisper. We meant no offense. But this soup, it's all we have for the next few days. My daughter, she's just a child. Can you not show mercy? For a moment, something flickered in Okonkwo's eyes. A brief flash that might have been shame or conscience. But it died as quickly as it appeared, smothered by years of unchallenged greed and power. Mercy? Okonkwo said softly. I show mercy by allowing you to live on my land. I show mercy by not increasing your taxes despite your poor harvests. And this is how you repay me? By questioning my judgment. He turned to Taiwo. Take the soup. All of it. Leave the pot. Taiwo moved forward reluctantly. Even he, who had witnessed countless acts of the chief's cruelty, seemed uncomfortable with this particular theft. He lifted the heavy pot with both hands, careful not to spill a drop of the precious contents. No, Alma cried out, tears streaming down her face. That's our soup. Mama's soup. Kofi grabbed her, holding her back as she struggled. Alma, stop. It's all right. But it wasn't all right. Nothing about this was all right. Kwame stepped in front of Taiwo, his face twisted with anger. This is wrong, Chief. You have everything, and you take from those who have nothing? What kind of man does that? Okonkwo's walking stick cracked against the ground. The kind of man who owns this village. The kind of man who can make you disappear if you don't step aside. Now move. For a terrible moment, Kofi thought his brother might actually fight. Kwame's hands were clenched into fists, his whole body rigid with fury. But then his shoulders sagged. What could they do? The chief had the law, the land, and the power. Fighting would only make things worse. Kwame stepped aside. Taiwo carried the pot away, following the chief back up the hill. The smell of groundnut soup lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of what they'd lost. Kofi stood with his arm around his sobbing daughter, watching the small procession disappear into the darkness. Papa, why? Alma whispered. Why did he take our food? Kofi had no answer. How do you explain cruelty to a child? How do you make sense of a world where the rich steal from the poor simply because they can? Kwame paced back and forth, his hands shaking. This cannot stand, brother. We cannot let him get away with this. What choice do we have? Kofi's voice was hollow. He owns everything. We own nothing. We own our dignity, our truth. Kwame pointed toward the hill where the chief's mansion glowed with lamplight. Men like him think they're untouchable. They think they can do whatever they want without consequence. But the ancestors are watching Kofi. The spirits see everything. Kofi wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe in justice, in karma, in some cosmic balance that would punish the wicked and reward the good. But he had seen too much suffering, too much injustice go unpunished. The ancestors didn't save ESI, he said quietly. They didn't stop the drought. They won't stop Okonkwo. Above them, the full moon had risen completely, bathing the village in silver light. In the old stories, the full moon was when the boundary between the living world and the spirit world grew thin. when the ancestors could reach across and touch the lives of mortals. But Kofi had stopped believing in old stories. Up on the hill, in his lavish dining hall, Chief Okonkwo sat before the pot of groundnut soup with a satisfied smile. He dipped his spoon into the thick, aromatic liquid and brought it to his lips. The taste exploded on his tongue. Nutty, savory, perfectly balanced. It was, without question, the best groundnut soup he had ever tasted. Excellent, he declared, taking another spoonful. Absolutely excellent. See, Taiwo? This is what I deserve. The very best of everything. Taiwo said nothing. He stood in the corner, his eyes downcast, thinking of the little girl's tears. Outside, the wind began to pick up. The palm trees around the mansion swayed violently, and in the distance, thunder rumbled. But Okonkwo paid no attention. He was too busy eating soup that didn't belong to him, stolen from a child who had nothing else. The full moon watched from above, round and bright and patient. 3 days passed. 3 days of Amma eating nothing but thin porridge made from the last handful of grain they had stored away. 3 days of Kofi working his barren field under the scorching sun, trying to coax life from soil that seemed as tired and depleted as he felt. 3 days of Kwame pacing their small compound, muttering about injustice and divine retribution. But the worst part wasn't the hunger or the exhaustion. It was the humiliation. Word had spread through the village about what Chief Okonkwo had done. Some people whispered in sympathy, but others laughed. They called Kofi weak, said he should have fought back, should have defended his family's food. Easy words from people who weren't facing eviction and starvation. On the third evening, as Kofi returned from the fields with aching muscles and empty hands, he found Mama Abina waiting at his compound. The old woman who had lost her goat to the chief's greed. Her weathered face was creased with worry. "Kofi, my son," she said, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "You must be careful. The chief is planning something." Kofi's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "My grandson works in the chief's kitchen. He overheard Okonkwo talking with his tax collectors. They're going to raise the land fees again.
Double them.
And those who cannot pay." She made a cutting gesture across her throat.
Out.
"All of you. He wants to give the land to wealthy merchants from the city." Kwame, who had been sitting nearby sharpening his knife, stood up abruptly. "Double? That's impossible. No one in the village can afford that." "That's the point," Mama Abina said bitterly. "He wants us gone. He's tired of dealing with poor farmers. Says we're more trouble than we're worth." Kofi felt the world tilting beneath his feet. This land had been in his family for generations. His father was buried here, and his father's father. If they lost it, they lost everything. "When?" he asked. "The announcement comes tomorrow night. At the full moon gathering." Of course. Tomorrow would be exactly 1 month since the last full moon. Since the chief had stolen their soup. Kofi looked up at the sky, where clouds were beginning to gather, thick and dark despite the season. The rains weren't supposed to come for another 2 months. "There's something else," Mama Abina said, lowering her voice. "Strange things have been happening at the chief's mansion. His servants are scared." "What kind of things?" Kwame asked, leaning forward. "Food spoiling the moment it's prepared. Wine turning to vinegar in his cup. And the chief himself, he's been having nightmares. Wakes up screaming about being buried alive, about the earth swallowing him." She glanced around nervously, as if afraid the trees themselves might be listening. "Some say it's because of what he did. Taking food from a child under the full moon, it's bad luck. Very bad luck." "Superstition," Kofi muttered, though he felt a chill run down his spine. "Maybe," Mama Abina said. "But 2 nights ago, lightning struck one of his palm trees. Split it right down the middle, and there hasn't been a storm. The sky was clear." She touched Kofi's arm gently. "I'm not saying the ancestors are real. I'm not saying they're watching. But I am saying that something is happening. The chief, he's afraid. I can see it in how he walks now, looking over his shoulder." After Mama Abina left, Kofi sat with his brother, watching Alma sleep on her mat. The girl was so thin now that her ribs showed through her worn dress. Rage and helplessness warred in Kofi's chest. "We have to do something," Kwame said. "We can't just let him destroy everyone." "What can we do?" "We're nobody." "We're not nobody," Kwame insisted. "We're human beings. We have voices. We have." Thunder boomed overhead, so loud that it shook the walls of their small house. Alma jerked awake with a cry, and Kofi rushed to comfort her. Through the open doorway, he could see the sky had turned black, though sunset was still an hour away. "Papa, I'm scared," Alma whispered. "It's just a storm, my flower. Nothing to fear." But even as he spoke, he wondered if that was true. The wind had picked up with unnatural speed, howling through the village like a living thing. Palm fronds tore from trees and tumbled through the streets. Dogs barked frantically, and somewhere in the distance, someone was shouting. Then the rain came. Not the gentle rain of the wet season, but a deluge that fell like stones from the sky. Water poured through the thatch roof, and within minutes, their floor had turned to mud. Kofi grabbed Alma and pulled her to the driest corner, with Kwame helping to shield them with a woven mat. "This isn't natural," Kwame shouted over the roar of the storm. "Brother, this isn't natural." Lightning flashed, turning the world white for an instant. In that brief illumination, Kofi could see out toward the hill where the chief's mansion stood. Another flash, and he saw something that made his blood freeze. The lightning was striking around the mansion. Not randomly, but in a circle, as if the sky itself was drawing a boundary. As if something was marking Okonkwo for judgment. "Did you see that?" Kwame grabbed Kofi's shoulder. "Did you see?" The storm intensified. Rain fell so hard that visibility dropped to nothing. The wind screamed like all the ancestors crying out at once. And above it all, thunder rolled continuously, not in separate crashes, but as one long, sustained roar. Up on the hill, Chief Okonkwo stood at his window, watching his world dissolve into chaos. His servants cowered in the corners of the mansion, praying to gods they'd half forgotten. 3 of his wives had already fled to their family homes. And the chief himself, the man who feared nothing and no one, felt terror creeping into his bones. The lightning was getting closer. Each strike seemed to be walking toward his mansion, deliberate and patient. The thunder sounded like a voice, deep and ancient, speaking words he couldn't quite understand but somehow knew were meant for him. "It's just a storm," he told himself, gripping the windowsill with white-knuckled hands. Just a storm. But he didn't believe it, because in his nightmares for the past 3 nights, he had seen this. Had seen the sky open up and rain judgment down upon him. Had seen a little girl's face, tear-stained and hungry, growing larger and larger until it filled the whole world. Taiwo appeared beside him, his voice shaking. "Master, we should go to the cellar. It's not safe here." "I am Chief Okonkwo," he roared, whirling on the servant. "I do not hide in cellars like a frightened child. This is my land, my village, my—" Lightning struck. Not near the mansion. Not around it. The bolt came down like a spear of white fire, hitting the roof directly above where Okonkwo stood. The explosion of sound and light sent both men stumbling backward. Smoke poured from the impact point, and flames began to lick at the wooden beams despite the torrential rain. "Fire!" someone screamed. Fire in the mansion. Servants scrambled for water, but the flames seemed to feed on their efforts, growing larger instead of smaller. Chief Okonkwo stood frozen, watching his pride, his symbol of power and wealth, begin to burn. And in that moment, as lightning continued to flash and thunder shook the earth, he finally understood. This was no random storm. This was an answer. By dawn, the storm had passed. The village of Adetala emerged into pale sunlight, assessing the damage. Roofs had been torn away, trees uprooted, and flooding had turned the streets into rivers of mud. But, remarkably, no one had been killed. No one except for the chief's prized cattle, 7 of them struck dead by lightning in their pen, 1 for each of his wives, the villagers would later whisper. Kofi stood with Kwame and Alma, staring up at the hill. The chief's mansion was still standing, but barely. The entire eastern wing had burned despite the rain, leaving a blackened skeleton of what had been the most opulent structure in the region. The white walls were scorched and cracked. The beautiful fountain had been destroyed by a fallen palm tree. But it was what the storm had revealed that made everyone stop and stare. The lightning strikes had torn up the ground around the mansion, and in doing so, had exposed something beneath the soil. Wooden boxes.
Dozens of them.
And when some brave souls had crept up at first light to investigate, they'd found them filled with gold, jewels, grain, and documents, titles to lands that the chief had claimed through lies and intimidation. Everything he'd stolen over the years, buried like a guilty secret. "The earth has spoken," Mama Abina said, standing beside Kofi with tears streaming down her weathered face. "The ancestors have shown us the truth." By midday, half the village had gathered at the base of the hill. They found Chief Okonkwo sitting in the ruins of his dining hall, staring at nothing. The man who had been so large and intimidating just days before now looked shrunken, diminished. His expensive robes were covered in ash and mud. His eyes were hollow. Taiwo stood nearby, and when he saw Kofi in the crowd, he approached with his head bowed. "The chief wishes to speak with you," the servant said quietly. Kofi's first instinct was to refuse, to let the man sit in the wreckage of his greed and think about what he'd done. But Kwame touched his arm. "Go, brother. Hear what he has to say. Not for him, for yourself." With Alma's hand in his, Kofi climbed the hill. The crowd parted to let them through, their eyes fixed on the little girl who had lost her soup and, in losing it, had somehow set divine wheels in motion. Chief Okonkwo looked up as they approached. His face was haggard, aged decades in a single night. "Kofi," he said, his voice cracking. I have no words." "Then why did you call for me?" Kofi asked. He was surprised by how calm he felt. The anger that had burned in him for days was gone, replaced by something closer to pity. "Because I need you to understand." Okonkwo gestured at the destruction around them. All of this, it started with that soup. Your daughter's soup. I took it because I could. Because I've spent so long taking whatever I wanted that I forgot." He paused, swallowing hard. "I forgot that there are powers greater than wealth. Greater than land or titles or gold." Alma stepped closer, her young voice clear in the morning air. "You took our soup, and you weren't even hungry." The simple truth of it seemed to break something in the chief. His shoulders shook, and tears began to roll down his face. "No," he whispered. "I wasn't hungry. I haven't been truly hungry a day in my life. But I was empty. So empty that I thought taking from others would fill the void inside me. And now." He looked at the exposed treasures scattered across his property. "Now everyone can see what I really am. A thief. A cruel, petty thief." "What will you do?" Kwame asked, speaking for the first time. Okonkwo stood slowly, his movements those of an old man. He walked to where the lightning had struck, leaving a scorched circle in the ground. "The full moon's mark, some would call it later. The land titles I forged, they're all there in those boxes. I will burn them. Every family will have their land returned, free and clear." He turned to face Kofi directly. "Your taxes are forgiven. For life. You and Alma will never pay another bronze piece to me." "And the others?" Kofi pressed. "The whole village? The same. All debts forgiven. All false claims erased." Okonkwo's voice grew stronger. "I cannot undo the years of pain I've caused. Cannot bring back what was lost. But I can stop. I can change. The storm has shown me that I must." Over the next few days, true to his word, Chief Okonkwo began the process of making amends. The hidden wealth was distributed to those he'd wronged. Land titles were returned. His remaining servants were given wages and the freedom to leave if they chose. Many did, though Taiwo stayed, saying someone needed to make sure the chief kept his promises. The mansion was partially rebuilt, but not to its former glory. Okonkwo kept only what he needed, living simply for the first time in his adult life. Some in the village said he'd learned his lesson. Others said it was fear of another storm, another act of divine retribution. Kofi didn't care which it was. All he knew was that his daughter had enough to eat. The fields were producing again, helped by seeds and tools that the chief had distributed from his hoarded supplies. Life was still hard, but it was no longer hopeless. 1 month later, on the next full moon, Kwame returned from his trading routes. This time, he brought ingredients not out of desperate charity, but for celebration. Together with Alma, they prepared groundnut soup again, the same recipe, the same love poured into each step. As the three of them sat around the pot, ready to eat, there was a knock at the compound gate. Chief Okonkwo stood there alone and humble, holding a small basket of vegetables. "I do not ask to join you," he said quietly. "I know I have no right, but I wanted to bring these from my garden. A gift. Not payment. Not obligation. Just a gift." Kofi looked at the man who had once stolen from his starving child, saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the weight of change in his posture. He thought about forgiveness, about second chances, about the long road from cruelty to kindness. "We have plenty," Kofi said finally. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Okonkwo's eyes widened. Are you certain?" "The storm taught you a lesson," Kofi said. "But it taught me one too. That even the hardest hearts can crack open. That even the worst among us can choose to be better."
He gestured to the pot.
"It's just soup, but it's meant to be shared." As they sat together, farmer, trader, child, and reformed chief, eating soup under the full moon's gentle light, something shifted in the village of Adetala. A healing had begun, slow and uncertain, but real. Alma looked up at the moon, that fat silver circle that had witnessed her tears and her hunger, that had somehow called down judgment on her behalf. "Thank you," she whispered to it. And maybe it was imagination, or maybe it was something more, but Kofi could have sworn the moonlight grew just a little brighter, as if the ancestors themselves were smiling down, satisfied that justice had been served and mercy had been learned. The groundnut soup tasted better than any meal Kofi could remember. Not because the ingredients were finer or the preparation more skillful, but because it was eaten without fear, without hunger, without the shadow of cruelty hanging over them. It was, in every way that mattered, perfect.